Richard Thompson was a millionaire used to controlling everything in his life, but nothing prepared him for the moment he saw his son, missing for years, selling candy on the street. Desperate, he approached the boy, and what he discovered left him in tears. Get ready for an emotional story of love, loss, and reunion. Richard Thompson, a 45-year-old man, lived a life that many would consider perfect. He was a brilliant businessman, owner of a fortune that seemed to grow every day, with a lavish mansion in the heart of New York City. Every detail of that residence screamed opulence: crystal chandeliers, rare works of art, and huge windows that offered a privileged view of Central Park. Despite this, for Richard, all of it was nothing but cold scenery, unable to fill the void that dominated his heart. His routine was meticulously calculated. Every day began at 6 in the morning, with coffee served by his housekeeper, followed by endless meetings in modern offices or high-level video calls. Richard was relentless in business, known for making quick decisions and for never allowing emotions to interfere with his goals. To others, he was the embodiment of success. For himself, however, he was just a broken man. The origin of this void dated back 3 years, when his perfect life crumbled. Liam, his 7-year-old son, disappeared during a trip to an amusement park. Richard remembered that afternoon as if it had happened yesterday. Liam's infectious laughter as he ran through the park still echoed in his mind. It was a rare day off that Richard had taken to spend with the boy, but his obsession with work followed him there. When the phone rang with an important business opportunity, he hesitated for a moment before answering, telling Liam not to wander off. When he finally hung up, there was no sign of his son. The days that followed were a blur of despair. Search teams, helicopters, and news reports brought no answers. Guilt consumed him daily. "I should have paid attention," he repeated to himself like a cruel mantra. Every business achievement since then felt bitter, a reminder that he had failed where it mattered most. Although Richard maintained a facade of strength, deep down he knew that all the money in the world would not be able to bring Liam back. Richard had moved mountains in his search for Liam. In the first months after his disappearance, he spent millions of dollars on private investigations and massive media campaigns. Billboards with the smiling face of the 7-year-old boy were spread throughout New York and neighboring cities, accompanied by emotional appeals. "If you have seen Liam, call immediately." Private investigators scoured every lead that emerged, while the police, initially committed, became less optimistic over time. The memory of the conversation with the chief detective was still a blow to his heart. "Mr. Thompson, we have done everything we could. There is no concrete evidence, no reliable witnesses. It's as if he vanished into thin air." Those words crushed him. Each day without answers was torture. Richard lived in a constant state of anxiety, alternating between hopeful phone calls and the suffocating silence of helplessness. The tragedy did not spare his marriage. Claire, his wife, could not forgive him for what she considered an unforgivable failure. "You should have been watching him, Richard. He needed you, and you were worried about business." Those accusations echoed in his mind even years later. The love between them was eroded by pain and guilt, until a year after Liam's disappearance, Claire decided to file for divorce. Richard signed the papers without contesting, knowing deep down that she was right. He had failed Liam and Claire. After the separation, Richard threw himself into work. It was his way of numbing the pain, filling his days with contracts, meetings, and financial goals. He continued to fund searches for his son, but hopes faded as the years went by. The image of Liam was still scattered across some websites and faded posters, but there were no new leads, only silence. No matter how much Richard tried to stifle his emotions, the emptiness was inescapable. At night, alone in the mansion, he faced Liam's room, untouched since the day he disappeared. That space, with toys scattered around, and a school uniform still folded on the bed, was a cruel reminder of his loss. He wondered daily if Liam was alive, if he was okay, and if he would ever see him again. On that day, after an exhausting meeting that dragged on for hours, Richard felt an unexpected need to escape. It was something rare for him, a man bound to his controlled routine, but the accumulated pressure made him abandon the comfort of being driven and choose to walk through the bustling streets of Manhattan. Dressed in his usual impeccable suit, He blended into the crowd, although he felt as if he were from another world. The streets were alive, as always. Street vendors shouted to attract customers, offering everything from hot pretzels to replicas of designer bags. Near the corners, people in vulnerable situations extended their hands asking for help. But Richard, by habit, kept his gaze fixed ahead, avoiding any eye contact. It was a form of protection, a way not to get emotionally involved. As he walked, feeling the biting cold of December, an unexpected scene caught his attention. In front of a small shop with a dirty window, a boy was sitting on an improvised bench, with a box full of candies. He offered the products to passers-by in a voice that was barely audible, while the wind tousled his hair. Richard slowed his pace, not understanding why that boy made him feel uneasy. There was something about the boy that seemed familiar. Perhaps it was the way he tilted his head when he spoke, or the deep brown eyes that reminded him of a distant and painful memory. Richard paused for a moment, feeling a different chill run down his spine. He tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was just his imagination, but he couldn't move on. In an impulsive gesture, something he rarely did, he walked towards the boy, with his heart racing and his mind filled with doubts. Richard approached the boy with hesitant steps, as if he were walking on thin ice. His heart seemed to hammer in his chest and his hands trembled slightly. He got close enough to observe the boy better, who was distractedly organizing the candies in the worn cardboard box. Messy brown hair, bright and lively eyes. It was as if he were looking at an older version of Liam. The resemblance was overwhelming. He stopped a few steps away, feeling the world around him fade into a blur. People passed by, horns honked in the background, but all Richard could see was that boy. For a moment, the pain he had carried for 3 years intensified, a wave of emotion that left him unable to speak. His hands clenched in the pockets of his coat as he struggled to catch his breath. The boy noticed his presence and looked up, clearly suspicious. "Do you want to buy a candy, sir? It's just $1, he said in a voice that almost made Richard lose his balance. There was something in that tone, in the way the words came out, that was terribly familiar. Richard cleared his throat, trying to stay calm. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice more tremulous than he would have liked. The boy hesitated, his eyes assessing the man in the suit who was staring at him. Finally, he replied with a serious, almost defensive expression. "My name is Billy." The name hit him like a punch to the stomach. Richard took a deep breath, searching for some sign in that this was real or just a cruel trick of his mind. "Billy," he repeated softly, savoring the word, trying to find in it some echo of the past. He looked closer. The way the boy held the candies, the slight furrow of his brow when he spoke. It was like looking at a younger version of himself reflected in Liam. "Do you have family around here?" Richard ventured, trying to keep his voice steady while his mind buzzed with questions. The boy simply shook his head and looked away, as if he didn't want to continue the conversation. For Richard, every detail was another piece of a puzzle he was desperate to put together. Richard felt his heart tighten as he struggled to find the right words. "Billy, where are your parents?" he asked, trying to sound as gentle as possible, but his voice carried an urgency he couldn't hide. The boy hesitated. His light eyes, so familiar, looked at Richard with a mix of distrust and discomfort. He replied in a low, almost reluctant tone, "I live with my Uncle Mark. He takes care of me." The answer sounded rehearsed, as if it had been said many times before, but the way Billy looked away and nervously fiddled with the hem of his worn jacket did not go unnoticed by Richard. "Your Uncle Mark? And your parents?" Richard pressed, trying not to push too hard. But each word was a battle against the whirlwind of emotions consuming him. He felt he was closer to answers than he had been in years, but he knew that one wrong move could push the boy away forever. Billy furrowed his brow and lowered his head, as if that question were forbidden. "I don't know. Uncle Mark said they couldn't take care of me, so now I live with him. We have to work to pay for things." He pointed with his chin at the box of candy. "I sell this to help." Richard observed the expression on the boy's face and felt a wave of indignation and despair. There was something deeply wrong with that story. The boy seemed insecure, as if he carried a weight far greater than he should for his age. He thought about asking more, but he knew he needed to be careful. Do you live nearby? He tried, adopting a more casual tone, almost as if he were chatting without intention. Billy looked up, and for a moment Richard saw the reflection of fear in his eyes. Uncle Mark said I can't talk to strangers about where we live, the boy replied with a defensive tone that contrasted with his vulnerable posture. He shrank slightly, as if preparing to be reprimanded for something. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He couldn't keep pressing the boy. That would only push him further away. But he also couldn't leave him there and simply go on with his life as if nothing had happened. There was a possibility, however small, that this boy was Liam, his Liam, and Richard couldn't ignore that. I understand, he said, trying to disguise the disappointment in his voice. You seem like a very strong boy, Billy. Your uncle must be proud of you. It was hard to say those words without letting the pain show, but Richard knew he needed to earn the boy's trust. Billy shrugged and turned his attention back to the candy, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. Richard took a step back, pretending to walk away. But his mind was made up. He couldn't just leave him there. He needed to find out more, without scaring him. So he made the decision to follow him at a distance. Pretending to walk away, Richard stopped near a storefront and feigned interest in the products while watching Billy through the glass reflection. The boy seemed restless, looking around as if he feared being watched. After a few minutes, he closed the candy box, tucked it under his arm, and began to walk down the sidewalk with quick steps. Richard waited long enough not to draw attention and followed the boy from afar, trying to stay calm even though his heart was racing. The walk was long. Billy turned corners, crossed busy streets, and entered more modest neighborhoods, far from the glamour of Manhattan's grand avenues. Each step Richard took led him deeper into unknown territory, but he couldn't stop. Doubts swirled in his mind. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a cruel coincidence? But he knew that if he gave up now, he would never forgive himself. Richard followed Billy to an even more degraded area, where the streetlights were scarce and the movement of people decreased with each step. The boy entered a narrow alley, surrounded by graffiti-covered walls and dumpsters. Richard hesitated, staying in the shadow of the corner to observe without being noticed. What he saw next made his stomach churn. A tall, rough-looking man was waiting at the end of the alley. He wore a thick coat and a cap that partially obscured his face, but the way he crossed his arms and tapped his foot on the ground made it clear that he was impatient. As soon as Billy approached, the man looked at him with a mix of impatience and irritation. "Okay, where's the money?" he asked, his voice rough and direct. Billy placed the box of sweets on the ground, opened his coat, and pulled out some crumpled bills from his pocket. He extended the money to the man, who grabbed the amount quickly, counting the bills with calloused fingers. His expression soured even more. "Is this all? Seriously, Billy? You spent the whole day out there and only managed this?" The man's voice rose, and the tone of frustration made the boy shrink his shoulders, as if trying to become invisible. "I tried, Uncle Mark." "People weren't buying today," Billy replied, his voice low and filled with fear. He avoided looking directly at the man, fixing his gaze on the ground as if he expected the worst. "That's no excuse," Mark exploded, gripping Billy's shoulder hard enough to make him take a step back. "Do you think I'm joking? If you don't sell enough, we don't eat. And you know what? If you don't come back tomorrow with double, don't even think about dinner. Got it?" Richard, hidden around the corner, felt his blood boil. He had to hold himself back from running up to the man at that moment and confronting him. But he knew that could be dangerous, not just for himself, but especially for Billy. Whether that man was really who he claimed to be, Uncle Mark, or just someone exploiting the boy, Richard still didn't know. But it was clear that Billy was in an unacceptable, vulnerable situation. Mark released Billy's shoulder and stuffed the money into his pocket, muttering something inaudible as he picked up the box of sweets from the ground. The boy remained still, head down, until the man made a brusque gesture with his hand. "Hurry up. We don't have all night." Billy immediately obeyed, walking behind Mark toward the alley's exit. Richard pressed himself against the wall, watching as the two disappeared into the shadows. His heart raced and his mind worked frantically, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Mark's behavior confirmed his suspicions that the man was not taking care of Billy as he should. Worse still, he treated him like a tool, exploiting the boy for his own profit. The anger Richard felt was overwhelming, but he knew he needed to stay calm. Confronting Mark at that moment would be risky. The man could flee, taking Billy with him, and then Richard might never find the boy again. No, he needed to act wisely, devise a careful plan that would ensure Billy's safety and give him definitive answers about who he was. Richard stayed there for a few minutes, waiting for the sound of their footsteps to completely fade away. Then he left his hiding place and walked to the alley where they had been moments before. He looked at the ground, trying to find any clue or something that could help him. Every second felt more important because he knew he was in a race against time. As he returned to his mansion that night, Richard felt he was about to unearth a secret that could change everything. He didn't know what would come next, but he was sure of one thing. He wouldn't rest until he freed Billy from Mark's clutches and discovered if that boy was, in fact, his lost son. Richard didn't waste any time getting home that night. Still shaken by what he had witnessed, he grabbed his phone and called William Blake, one of the best private investigators in New York City. Blake was known for his discretion and ability to solve complicated cases, and Richard knew he needed someone like that to uncover the truth about Billy and Mark. "I need you to follow a man named Mark. He is with a boy who might be my missing son. I want to know everything about him, where he lives, who he hangs out with, where he came from, everything," Richard explained, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotion that was evident. Blake, as always, was straightforward. "Understood, Mr. Thompson. I will start immediately. Send me everything you remember about them. Every detail helps." In the days that followed, Richard plunged into paralyzing anxiety. He tried to focus on work, but the thought of Billy, or perhaps Liam, wouldn't leave his mind. The image of the boy, the sound of his voice, the fear in his eyes when he was in front of Mark, it all haunted him. He spent hours revisiting the last time he saw Liam, trying to remember every detail that could help. It was a mix of hope and fear. Hope that he had finally found his son, and fear that it was just another false lead, like so many others in the past 3 years. When the phone finally rang 5 days later, Richard answered immediately. It was Blake. "I have important information," the investigator said, in his usual professional tone. "We need to meet." In Richard's office, Blake arrived with a thick folder in hand. He placed it on the table, opened it, and began to explain what he had discovered. Mark is not, in fact, the biological uncle of the boy he calls Billy. In reality, he seems to have found the boy in a small town in rural Massachusetts called Springfield about 2 years ago. Richard's eyes widened, his breath quickening. "Found? What do you mean by that?" "According to some local sources I investigated, Mark appeared in town with Billy suddenly. People noticed because he started using the boy to sell candy and other products at public events. No one knows exactly where the boy came from, but some witnesses remember seeing him before, wandering alone in the streets. Mark apparently picked him up and brought him to New York, where he began to exploit him." Blake paused, took a photograph from the folder, and handed it to Richard. It was a recent image of Billy, taken discreetly by Blake during the investigation. "I compared the boy's features with the descriptions and old photos of Liam that you provided me. The eyes, the hair, even a small scar on the left eyebrow. Everything matches the description of your son." Richard held the photo with trembling hands, his heart racing. It was like looking at Liam, but older. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but the emotion was overwhelming. "And Mark?" he asked, his voice low. "Who is he? What does he want with Billy?" "Mark has a history of minor crimes, theft, fraud, and it seems he has been surviving on schemes like this, using children to sell things on the streets. He knows how to avoid drawing police attention, but he doesn't seem to be a dangerous criminal, just an opportunist." Blake paused, looking at Richard seriously. "But that doesn't change the fact that Billy is in a risky situation. He needs to be taken out of Mark's hands, and soon." Richard felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief for being closer to answers, for having a concrete hope that this boy could really be Liam. But the anger was overwhelming. The thought that someone had exploited and mistreated the boy for so long made his blood boil. He knew he couldn't act impulsively. He needed a plan, something that would ensure Billy's safety and confirm once and for all if he was Liam. "Thank you, Blake," Richard said, still staring at the photo of the boy. "Now we need to go all the way. I want to know everything about Mark's whereabouts and how we can get him away from Billy without putting the boy in danger." Blake nodded. "I'm already working on it, Mr. Thompson. I have contacts who can help us. I will continue to monitor Mark's movements and devise a strategy. As soon as I have something concrete, I will let you know." As Blake left, Richard remained in the office, looking at the photo of Billy. The hope he was trying to contain was now a living flame inside him. But he knew that the path to rescuing the boy would be delicate. He would need strength, patience, and above all, faith that he was closer to bringing Liam back home. Richard knew he needed to be meticulous to avoid raising suspicions. He decided that the best way to confront Mark was to approach him without revealing his intentions. The next morning, dressed casually to avoid looking out of place, he went to the spot where Billy usually sold candy. He watched from a distance until he saw Mark arriving with the boy, carrying the same battered box. Richard took a deep breath and walked towards the man. "Good morning," Richard said, forcing a friendly smile as he pointed to the box of candy. "What are you selling here?" Mark looked him up and down, suspicious, but quickly adjusted his posture when he noticed the expensive watch on Richard's wrist and his confident demeanor. "Candy, sir. Great handmade candy. Cheap, too." He gave a forced smile and gestured to Billy, who immediately opened the box to display the products. Richard pretended to study the candy with exaggerated interest while his mind worked frantically. They look good. Do you make them yourselves?" "Sure, something like that," Mark replied, deflecting and clearly eager to close any sale. "The kid here is great at it, right, Billy?" He patted the boy's shoulder, who avoided looking at Richard. The tension was palpable. "Yeah, he does seem like a good worker," Richard said, carefully observing Billy's reaction. He turned his attention back to Mark, trying to sound casual. "Are you always here with him? Seems like a good spot to sell." Mark shrugged. "We manage. We do what we can." Richard realized the man was cautious, but not immune to the temptation of easy money. He decided to change tactics, leaning slightly towards Mark as if to confide something. "You know," he began, "I'm the kind of guy who likes to support small ventures, and I need some candy for a corporate event. How about I buy everything you have today?" Mark raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. "Everything? Seriously?" "Yes," Richard confirmed, smiling calculatedly. "And if you can bring more tomorrow, I'll buy everything again. How about it? I'll pay a fair price, say $100 today, and more tomorrow. No complications." Mark's eyes lit up at the mention of money. It was evident he was doing the calculations in his head. $100, huh? That's a good deal, he said, trying to mask his greed. "Sure, we can bring more tomorrow. Same time, right here." "Perfect," Richard replied, carefully handing the bills to Mark. "Tomorrow at the same time, then. I'll need a lot. I hope the boy's ready for work." He cast a discreet glance at Billy, who remained quiet but was clearly curious about the man asking so many questions. Mark nodded, satisfied with the deal. "No problem, sir. We'll be here." As he walked away, Richard felt his heart racing. He had set the bait, but he knew he needed to be prepared for the next day. The risk was high, but this was the opportunity to ensure that Mark and Billy were in the same place, giving Blake and the authorities a chance to intervene. On his way home, Richard contacted Blake. "Everything's set. Mark will be at the same location tomorrow with Billy. I want you there with backup to ensure we can act safely. This is the moment." The next day, Richard arrived at the square punctually, his heart heavy with a mix of anxiety and hope. He observed the place from a distance until he spotted Mark and Billy arriving. The boy was carrying the same box of sweets, his shoulders slumped, while Mark, with his usual impatient demeanor, gestured and gave orders. Richard took a deep breath, adjusted his coat, and approached with firm steps. "Good morning," he said in a friendly yet controlled tone. "Ready for another deal?" Mark flashed a forced smile, taking the box of sweets from Billy's hands and placing it on the bench in the square. "Of course, sir. We have what you need." Richard, however, was focused on Billy. Kneeling down to the boy's height, he gently asked, "And you, Billy, are you okay today?" Billy shrugged, visibly uncomfortable. I'm It's just another day, he murmured. Richard took a deep breath and decided to press on with more questions. You know, I've been thinking about the dog you mentioned yesterday, Max. What was he like? The boy looked at Richard, hesitant, but replied in a tone that seemed almost nostalgic. He was big, kind of clumsy, but really nice. He had a black spot on his ear, and he always slept on the living room rug. I used to play with him in the yard. Richard felt the words hit him like thunder. Every detail was accurate. He looked at the boy with misty eyes, unable to hold back the tears that were now rolling down his face. Liam, he whispered, his voice choked. That was the name of our family dog. You are my son. You are Liam. Billy blinked, confused, taking a step back. What? No. Uncle Mark said my parents couldn't take care of me. Richard swallowed hard, kneeling in front of the boy. That's not true. You disappeared 3 years ago, during a trip. I've searched for you every day since then. I never gave up, Liam. You are my son, and I am your father. The boy looked at him, his eyes filled with doubt and fear, while Mark, realizing the direction of the conversation, abruptly intervened. What is this? What kind of nonsense are you talking about? Billy is my nephew, and you're getting things mixed up. His voice was filled with nervousness, and Richard realized it was the reaction of a cornered man. Richard stood up, facing Mark with determination. Stop lying. I know who you are and what you've done. I've already called the police. They are on their way. Mark paled and took a step back, his eyes scanning the square for an escape route. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. But before he could flee, 2 plainclothes police officers appeared, quickly surrounding him. Mark Evans, one of the officers asked, you are under arrest for kidnapping and child exploitation. Do not resist. Mark tried to protest, but the officers were already handcuffing him, ignoring his screams. Billy watched everything in silence, his eyes wide, clutching the box of sweets as if it were a shield. When Mark was taken away, the boy looked lost, unsure of where to run. Richard turned to him, his voice trembling with emotion. Liam, it's okay now. You are safe. No one will ever hurt you again. The boy hesitated, his hands clutching the box against his chest. Are you really my father? He asked, his voice laden with uncertainty and fragility. Richard nodded, tears falling freely as he opened his arms. I am, and I should have never let you go. Forgive me, son. Liam took a hesitant step, then another, until he finally dropped the box and threw himself into Richard's arms. The man held him tightly, feeling the warmth of his son's body after years of emptiness. Tears of relief and happiness streamed down Richard's face as he repeatedly said, I love you, Liam. I love you so much. I will never let you go again. As the two remained there, embraced, Richard knew that despite the long road of healing ahead, this was the moment he had waited for during all the years of pain and loneliness. He finally had his son back. After the commotion in the square, Richard wasted no time. He took Liam directly to a hospital, where he insisted that a medical team examine him thoroughly. While waiting in the hallway, sitting in an uncomfortable chair, he couldn't stop watching the boy. Even after everything that had happened, it still felt surreal. Liam was there, within reach of his eyes, after 3 years that felt like an eternity. The exams were conducted carefully, and a few hours later, the pediatrician appeared with a reassuring expression. Your son is healthy, he said, smiling at Richard. He is a bit malnourished and has clearly been through stressful situations, but nothing that good nutrition, rest, and follow-up can't resolve. Richard felt a weight lift off his shoulders, although he was still deeply shaken by everything Liam had faced. He thanked the doctor and returned to the room where the boy was sitting, eating a bowl of hot soup. Liam seemed more relaxed now, although he still maintained a certain reserve in his expression. How are you, son? Richard asked, sitting down next to him. Better, Liam replied between spoonfuls. He looked at Richard, his eyes shining with something that seemed to be curiosity. I remember some things from our house. That dog, Max, he always barked when someone got close to the door. Richard smiled, his heart racing at hearing the boy mention old memories. Yes, he did. He was a great dog. You loved playing with him in the yard. Liam hesitated for a moment before continuing. And there was a swing In the yard, too. I fell once, and you ran to catch me before I started to cry. Richard chuckled softly, tears threatening to return. That's true. And you got mad at me because I said I was going to take the swing down. But you convinced me to leave it there. The boy smiled for the first time, shy but genuine. It was as if the barriers began to dissolve, allowing memories of a happy childhood to resurface. That night, while Liam slept in the guest room that Richard had prepared with great care, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. His heart raced, and he needed a few seconds before pressing the call button. Claire's familiar voice answered on the other end. "Richard?" she asked, surprised. "Why are you calling me so late?" "Claire," he began, trying to control the emotion in his voice. "I found Liam, our son. He is here with me." There was a long silence, followed by a muffled sound, as if Claire had dropped the phone. When she finally came back on the line, her voice was trembling. You are serious? Liam? He is alive?" "Yes," Richard replied, tears streaming down his face. "I found him. He is okay, but he needs us, Claire. Please come to New York. He needs to see you." "I'm on my way," she said, her voice full of determination. "I will take the first flight. Please, Richard, take care of him until I arrive." The next morning, Richard and Liam were in the living room when the doorbell rang. Richard quickly got up, knowing exactly who it was. He opened the door, and there was Claire, with red and swollen eyes from crying, but with a glimmer of hope on her face. Before he could say anything, she rushed past him and looked at Liam. The boy stared at her with curiosity, but there was something in Claire's eyes that made him recognize who she was. "Mommy?" he asked, his voice fragile. Claire let out a sob, running to him and hugging him tightly, as if fearing he might disappear again. "Yes, it's me, my love. It's me." She cried continuously, caressing the boy's face, kissing his forehead, while Liam, still confused, began to cry too, as if he finally understood that he was safe. Months had passed since Richard's reunion with Liam, and the transformation in everyone's lives was evident. Liam, now with the sparkle of childhood restored, had started attending school again. He was quickly adapting, making new friends, and rediscovering the joy of learning and playing. His natural curiosity and contagious energy brought life to every environment he occupied. Richard, for his part, was a changed man. The experience of losing and finding Liam had completely altered his perspective on what was important. He still managed his business, but now with clear boundaries. Endless meetings and late-night phone calls were no longer a priority. Instead, he dedicated a good part of his time to his son, taking him to the park, helping him with homework, and even allowing himself moments of relaxation that he had previously deemed impossible. Claire had also found happiness again alongside her son. Although her relationship with Richard was still being rebuilt, they had made a pact. All that mattered was Liam. As parents, they were more united than ever, creating a solid and loving foundation for the boy to grow. Gradually, the lost complicity between them began to rise again, marked by honest conversations and shared laughter. On a Sunday afternoon, the sun streamed through the large windows of the house as the family spent the day together in the living room. Liam was sitting on the carpet, with a drawing pad open in front of him and colored pencils scattered all around. He was drawing intently, his tongue slightly sticking out, while his parents watched him from a nearby sofa. "What are you drawing, son?" Richard asked, leaning in to peek at the pad. "Max," Liam replied, not taking his eyes off the paper. He gave a mischievous smile. "I think he would be happy to see me now." Richard and Claire exchanged a glance. Both moved. The dog, who had been such an important part of Liam's childhood, was now re-emerging as a symbol of all the memories that were coming back, of everything that was being rebuilt. "It's looking amazing," Claire said, kneeling beside her son to observe the drawing. "You have your father's talent. He was also good at drawing when he was little." "Me?" Richard laughed, raising his hands. "I don't believe that. I think you're exaggerating." Liam looked at him with a smile. "Maybe I learned from you, Dad." Those simple words touched Richard deeply. He realized how much he had gained since the day he found Liam. The emptiness that had once consumed him had been filled with something much greater: the unconditional love of family. For the first time in years, he felt complete. As Liam finished his drawing, Richard picked him up and lifted him into the air, making the boy laugh. Claire laughed along, watching the two with tenderness. In that moment, the house was full of life, joy, and love, everything Richard had always dreamed of, but had only now learned to truly appreciate. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange, Richard looked around and smiled. He knew that his life would never be perfect, but in that moment, with Liam and Claire by his side, it was everything he could wish for. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.